The last U.S. presidential election was polarizing, to say the least. Through the course of the election and its aftermath, it left many Americans, both on the right and on the left, wondering why the democratic process works the way it does. Today, I'm joined by an economist and a philosopher to help sort this out. My first guest is Dr. Randall Holcomb. Dr. Holcomb is the DeVoe Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. He's the author of 15 books, including the recent Advanced Introduction to Public Choice. Randy, welcome to Texas Tech and to the show.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's great to be here.
So, your new book on public choice. Public choice is the economic analysis of politics. That's not public policy analysis. What does it mean? What is the economic way of looking at politics?
So what we do is we try to take the same tools of economics that we use to analyze markets and use those same tools to analyze political decision making. So often what happens when people look at public policy issues, they see all these problems with the markets, say government ought to do something, but then they just assume government's going to do the ideal thing. So what public choice does is try to look at what government actually will do, how government actually works, rather than how we would hope it would work.
So things like from economics of looking at the incentives that people face, we now are going to do that to politicians and to the entire political process.
Sure. I think there are two big issues that you want to look at taking a public choice approach. The first is information. Do the policymakers and decision makers have enough information to make an optimal decision? And all the time, academic economists and the general public overlooks this. You know, we do like things like macroeconomic policy. We need more stimulus. No, we need less stimulus. Experts on both sides of the issue. But the real question is, does anybody have enough information to make the optimal decision? And then there's the incentives. Even if we have the information, do the decision makers actually have the incentive to undertake an optimal policy?
Right, so let's talk about that for a moment then, maybe about the incentives of the politicians. Do you assume that they are greedy or benevolent or malevolent? What is the equivalent of taking economic assumptions from the private sphere and moving it to the politician?
Well, we just, like the way we analyze consumer decision making in the private sector, we ask what's in their best interest. And in some ways, the general public has caught on to this more than academics. Everybody knows politicians make decisions and policy choices in order to enhance their chances of re-election. They want to build their political popularity. They want to enhance their chance of re-election. That's not always the optimal policy. I mean, we even know a lot of times they're making decisions not because it's good public policy, but because it'll get them more political support. So let's take what the general public already knows and incorporate that into our academic analysis of the political process.
So in its most basic sense, it's still just treating people as people. The guy who was a used car salesman yesterday and gets elected to Congress isn't fundamentally a different person.
No, we just assume that people are acting in what's in their own best interest. And of course, we know people aren't entirely self-centered. A lot of times they'll try to do things that are in the public interest. Both in the private sector and in the public sector. People are charitable in the private sector. But at the same time, if there are costs involved, if a politician wants to get reelected, he needs to weigh, well, gosh, if I'm going to stay in office and do all these good things for the general public, I need to get reelected first. So I'll make this decision in order to build my political popularity, even if it doesn't seem like it's an optimal decision in some other dimension.
Right, and these other dimensions that they could, ultimately it's that political decision of re-election that we're hopeful that disciplines them actually from doing the, I'll just pass policies that benefit me personally, financially, or my friends or something like that.
Sure. And we see that there's a big incumbent advantage. So once you're elected, there's a pretty good chance you'll get reelected. So people a lot of times politicians make decisions that are in their own personal interest. But all too often what happens is they're helping out their cronies in the private sector in exchange for the cronies helping out them in the public sector. So I don't think the Occupy Wall Street people were too off base when they're talking about public policy that benefits the 1% at the expense of the 99%.
So yeah, I think you're right. But let's work our way there with the voters then, because this is the disciplinary device is the voters. Supposedly, if they were crony politicians who were making special deals to their buddies, it's when they go to the ballot box that the voters get to put the smack down on them, right?
We would hope that they would, but one problem is voters don't always have an incentive. Well, voters don't have an incentive to be fully informed. That your one vote isn't going to change the outcome of the election, so you don't have very much incentive to collect up a lot of information. And furthermore, a lot of times...
But wait a second, come on. Everyone will tell you, everybody's vote counts.
We add up all the votes together and everybody's votes in the aggregate count. But no one individual vote counts, right? I mean, if you had voted for Trump in the last election, who would have won? Well, Trump. But what if you'd voted for Clinton? Trump still would have won. What if you didn't vote at all? Trump still would have won. So even though we pay lip service to the idea that every vote counts, you know that no matter how you vote, the outcome of the election is going to be the same.
What about like in 2000? It was so close with Gore and Bush in your home state of Florida, right?
It was so close. That's an interesting election because there it came down to about 600 votes or so. And ultimately what happened was the Supreme Court decided here's how we're going to count the votes. So ultimately nobody's vote really counted. It was the Supreme Court that ultimately decided the outcome of the election, not adding up the votes one way or another.
Even in that extreme rare case. So actually, economists have looked at this. Haven't they figured out that you're more likely to die in a car accident while going to vote than change the outcome of a national election?
Sure, and the general public knows that. So when you're going to vote, people are showing up to vote for reasons other than that they think my vote will change the outcome of the election. And sometimes it's just that you feel solidarity with a particular group. You know, all my friends are voting this way. I want to feel solidarity with the group. I feel great because I'm voting the way my friends are. So there are a lot of reasons that people might show up to vote and cast their vote a certain way that doesn't really have to do with the issues or the public policies that would result.
Yeah, you know, actually a nice maybe a parallel to that is, you know, here at Texas Tech, we'll go to the football game and I'll clap at the game, but my extra clap, like I'm not delusional that the lineman all of a sudden heard me on third down. I'm like, oh, I heard Ben's extra clap. Now I'm going to try harder, right?
Sure,
I wanted to be part of the experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm well informed about the technicalities of the football game.
Oh yeah, yeah. Some people are fans of politics the same way other people are fans of sports. But you know, just being a fan, that's not going to change the outcome of the game. And being interested in politics, even if you're very engaged, still your one vote isn't going to change the outcome of the election.
So the punchline of that then is, what does it give people for an incentive to learn and discipline politicians?
I think the sports analogy is a good one. You know, some people are interested in politics. They collect up a lot of information. Most voters have a little bit of knowledge. Maybe they're not fully informed. And so politicians run on other things besides the issues. In fact, if you listen to campaigns, politicians very rarely say, here's exactly what I'm going to do when I'm elected. But rather they run on aspirations. Political messages essentially say, things aren't as good as they could be right now, but if you elect me, I'm going to make them better.
Gee, that sounds like Make America Great Again.
Exactly. I mean, you look at President Trump's pronouncements on trade. He said, we've got these bad deals, NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and if you elect me, I'm going to make things better. But he never said, what's wrong with NAFTA? He never said what's wrong with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he never said, if I renegotiate and make them better, here are the things I would get. He was using a specific example, but what he's saying is things aren't as good as they could be, elect me and things will be better. And I'm not really picking on President Trump here.
Sure.
I mean, every politician does that. President Obama ran on a slogan of hope and change. Right. I mean, what does that mean?
God, I hate hope and change.
Yeah, exactly.
So these things appeal to voters who are otherwise not well informed about what the actual policies implemented are, but not everybody is equally ignorant of these things.
No, but it's an emotional appeal. And I think you find in political campaigns, a few people might change their mind as a campaign goes on, but really what the candidates are trying to do is to motivate turnout for the people who would vote for them anyway. And when you look at the last presidential election, actually President Trump got about the same number of votes as Mitt Romney got before him and John McCain got before him. So how did he end up winning the election? Hillary Clinton didn't get as many votes as Barack Obama. So it was a matter of turnout that she wasn't able to motivate her base to turn out.
And then afterwards, when it comes to actually formulating policy, if they redo the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, very few voters are actually ever going to read through and figure out whether they think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but some people are, right?
I don't know who would be. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was 5,000 pages. So how many people are actually going to read 5,000 pages of a trade agreement and know what's in there?
Probably only ones they themselves are getting trade favors
Sure.
or benefits, right?
Exactly.
So this kind of leads to what's the logic for politicians to get ahead then, the logic of collective action. How do they compete within the system?
Well, really what they try to do is to gain supporters. They try to trade benefits that they get for support that they can get from other people. But the people who give them that support, that's you and me a little bit, but really it's the cronies, the big players. So the economic elite, the political elite, they trade with each other. And this idea of crony capitalism that's increasingly visible, it's a pretty good description of the way that political exchange takes place.
Yeah, the politicians benefits the cronies who know about it, and most voters don't know the details. So in the last just 30 seconds or so here, what if democracy has this problem when it goes to choose public policies? What's democracy good for?
Democracy is a good way for changing the people who have political power without violence. That we can unelect them, and we don't have to have wars or revolutions, uprisings. But it's not really a good way to make public policy if we think of democracy in a sense of carrying out the will of the majority. And indeed, our founding fathers had this idea. We have a constitutionally limited government, and government does those things that are the powers that are enumerated in the Constitution. Our founding fathers had no concept of we're creating a government that carries out the will of the majority. They created a constitutionally limited government to protect individual rights.
Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Despite its many problems, many people believe that participation in the democratic process makes us more knowledgeable and better citizens. My next guest thinks otherwise. Stick around to find out why.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Jason Brennan. Dr. Brennan is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Chair and Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Man, that's a mouthful. He's also the author of 8 books, including Against Democracy, that we'll be discussing today. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, I know you just heard the first half of this episode while we were talking about public choice, but democracy has its problems that he outlined, but you wrote a book called Against Democracy. Who can be against democracy?
Well, I think people are for democracy in the way they're for Santa Claus. You see, when you think about how the average person, the average philosopher writes about democracy, they're not talking about the actual thing that's out there in the world that happens. They're talking about a wish list of stuff that they want to happen. So the difference for me is I'm just actually paying attention to the way the world works. And when you actually look at how democracy works, it's actually pretty ugly. So like a metaphor I like to use to sort of illustrate that is, imagine you've been accused of murder and you go to a jury trial and the jury pays no attention at all to the facts of the case. They just flip a coin at the end and decide to find you guilty. We would think that's evil. Suppose they do pay attention to the facts of the case, but they don't interpret them correctly. They interpret them on the basis of some bizarre conspiracy theory they believe in. They think you're one of the lizard people. We would think that's evil. Or suppose they just find you guilty out of malevolence. We would think that's evil. So we have this idea that in lots of cases, the people who hold power should exercise it competently and in good faith. And then we can go and check, does democracy exercise power competently and in good faith? I think the answer is no, it doesn't.
So in what way, so I like this jury example that you gave, and yeah, I want them to study the case and to make rational decisions, but where do you see the failure in democracy in doing this, of thinking about these things justly and scientifically?
Well, there's lots of people to point fingers at, and government agents make mistakes, politicians make mistakes, but I actually think it's the people that really deserve a lot of the blame. Because at the end of the day, as we were just talking about the last segment, politicians are responding to the populace. The thing is, democracy works in the sense that politicians do in fact cater to the expressed interest of the people. But what if the people have no idea what they're talking about? We ask them about, to make economic decisions, but they would fail Econ 101. They don't even know who their Congress people are half the time. They don't know what happened 6 months ago. They don't know what could have been done. So we have an incompetent population, and they're picking really important decisions.
So you're not really disputing, though, the intelligence or the competence of the people themselves. Yeah. It's the context within which they're making decisions.
Yeah, I'm not in at least any interesting sense. I think the average person is really smart and can run his or her life, but democracy makes us stupid. We're dumb because of the incentives. So what happens is the probability that my vote is going to be decisive in any major election is so vanishingly small that I have no incentive to be informed or to think rationally about it. You might think of it as I'll consume information and I'll process that information in a rational way if the benefits of doing so exceed the costs. Because my vote doesn't really matter, the costs always exceed the benefits. And so if I do consume information, I'm going to do it in a biased way to show my fidelity to my the people that live around me and that I'm on their team, or I'm going to just indulge my biases, or I'll just ignore the information altogether.
And have a good time while doing it.
Yeah, that's right. Voting feels good, but you don't have to do it well.
So you've talked about different types of people in the political process that you characterize as hobbits, hooligans, or Vulcans.
Vulcans, yeah.
Tell me what you mean by that and how it applies to voters.
Yeah, so if you've read the Lord of the Rings books or seen the movies, hobbits are these creatures that just want to live their lives, eat breakfast in elevensies and their second breakfast and sort of smoke their pipes. They don't care much about the outside world. And the political analog of that would be someone who doesn't have strong or fixed opinions about politics, doesn't pay much attention to it, doesn't participate much. And roughly about half of Americans are hobbits, so described. The typical person who doesn't vote is a hobbit. If you've ever been to a soccer/football game in a country that cares about football, you've run into the soccer hooligans. And hooligans are people who care a lot about the sport, and they often have an incredible amount of knowledge, but they're also incredibly biased. They process information in a way that makes their side look good. So for example, when Tom Brady was accused of deflating footballs, you and I, of course, correctly assessed that he wasn't actually guilty because we're Patriots fans, but the rest of the country thinks he was guilty. We have access to all the same information, but we interpret that information in a way that makes our side look good.
Yeah, so, of course, we were right in this.
Yeah, we were right. That's a bad example because there's a truth of the matter, and Tom Brady was in fact innocent. But the political analog would be your typical voter. Your typical voter has a strong opinion. They actually know a little bit more than non-voters. They're not highly informed. They know something, but they process information in an incredibly biased way. They only look for information that confirms their worldview. They are unfair to the other side, and so on. And then Vulcans are kind of this ideal type of this perfectly rational being that's not loyal to his or her beliefs and is willing to change their beliefs when new evidence comes in. And I bring them up not because I think there really are Vulcans, but because when you read what philosophers say about democracy and how it's supposed to work, they're writing as if people were Vulcans, when in fact they're hobbits and hooligans. Democracy is the rule of hobbits and hooligans.
So, doesn't everybody, though, through the participation in the process, there's the people who are hobbits, when they do start participating in the process, the hope is that they become Vulcans.
Yeah. That was the hope. John Stuart Mill, an early defender of liberal democracy, or at least representative government, if not democracy per se, had this hope that getting your average factory worker, say in Manchester, England, to start participating in politics would be like getting a fish to discover that there's a world outside the sea. But whether that's true or not is an empirical question, and we now have data on this. 65 years of data and experiments and all sorts of research studying what political participation does to people. And I think Mill was wrong, and I think he would agree. In fact, you could think of it as people are sort of inherently biased, and even the ones who don't have an opinion, they would be biased if only they had one. When we get people together to talk and deliberate and communicate about politics, we usually get fairly negative results. They become more extreme in their opinions. They become hateful towards the other side. They don't really learn anything from the other side. Things like physical appearance and charisma dominate over things like the quality of their arguments. So I think the truth of the matter is closer to what Schumpeter said, which is that when you get people to participate in politics, they start reasoning in a way that they would find infantile in any other sphere.
A lot of people, though, think that it's your civic duty that you should participate in this process. It's it's your American duty. It's not just your right, your privilege, but your duty. Yeah. What do you say to this as a philosopher?
Well, it's weird to think it would be your duty if you don't do it very well, because I think the average voter isn't doing anyone a favor by voting any more than they're doing a favor by scratching people's cars or puncturing tires. But the arguments that people give on behalf of the duty to vote are really things like, well, you have to avoid free riding on government, or you have to do your part, you should do something to help other people. And note that only makes sense if you're, first of all, voting well, which most people don't. But even then, these very general principles, help others, do your part, avoid free riding, avoid complicity with injustice, there's millions of possible ways to discharge those duties. I think the average motorcycle mechanic does more for society by fixing motorcycles than the average voter does by voting well. I think the average stay-at-home parent does more for society by raising their children well than they do by voting well or knowing a lot about politics. So, voting is one way to discharge these general duties, but it's just one way among many.
And it's one way only if done well, because
Yes.
otherwise you're like the motorcycle mechanic who's pouring sand in the engine instead of oil.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of voting is more like pollution than it is like cleaning. It's pollution. It's making things worse. Politicians respond to what voters want, and if we flood the polls with uninformed or misinformed voters, what we get is an electorate that pushes for policies that are counterproductive and harmful. Who's that helping?
So how do you think the process could work any better? My last guest kind of said constitutional republic principles not as a method of choosing. What about you? What are your ideas?
Well, an idea that I've been toying with is something called epistocracy. It's the idea of an epistocracy is a representative form of government, but you don't by law have universal equal suffrage. Some people have more votes than others, or higher weighted votes than others. And this, of course, is going to bring up all sorts of alarm bells about why this is evil. And I have, of course, decisive responses to all those objections in the book. But just in the abstract, an epistocracy might be some system in which, say, if you pass a competence exam, you get an extra vote, rather than just everyone starts with one vote, but you can earn an extra one.
So you're not taking away anybody's franchise.
Or you could have...
You're just adding to some people's franchise.
Maybe. Or you could have a system in which, by default, everyone's equal in having no votes, but you have to sort of show competence to get any votes. You could have a system in which experts can veto democratic legislation, but they can't themselves pass legislation. Another system that I think might be perhaps the most feasible and would overcome a lot of objections is what I call government by simulated oracle. And what happens in that is...
So, say, government by simulated oracle?
By simulated oracle. The idea here is if we had an oracle that knows better than we do about what to do with politics, like we have this good oracle and always knows the right answer, we should ask it rather than doing what we in fact want. So if the oracle disagrees with us, we're like, oh, well, we're wrong, we should do what the oracle says. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any real oracles, but we can kind of construct one. And the way to do it is pretty simple, in fact. You just have people vote, and you get down their policy preferences, you collect data on who they are, their demographic characteristics, are you rich, are you employed, or what's your race, and so on. And then you give them a quiz of basic questions about political knowledge. Just who's the president, who's the vice president, what's the unemployment rate within 5 percentage points. When you get those 3 sets of data together, you can then statistically determine, using sort of like second semester graduate statistics, what the public would want, keeping its demographics exactly the same, if only it were fully informed. And then the idea is you do that instead of what the actual unenlightened public wants. We can say, okay, this is what, if we were informed, we would want this, not this, so let's do that.
I bet you're going to get a lot of objections to this.
Yeah, I mean, people have a view that democracy is inherently just. They have 12 or so arguments I kind of go through in the book to try to deal with that. Some people say, well, democracy is good because it's a fair system. It's not really very compelling because if all you care about is fairness, then you could just flip a coin. That's actually more fair. Some people say things like, well, I'm worried under this system that people will be biased. If you limit power, then people will be biased to use power for their own interests. And that's true if you limit it to a very small subset of people, but as long as it's fairly widespread, we know empirically people vote altruistically rather than selfishly. The problem with voters isn't that they're selfish, it's that they're dumb. So what we want to do is sort of select among the electorate to get a more knowledgeable but still altruistic subset. People will claim things like, well, we know that knowledge is not evenly dispersed among, say, all ethnic groups or all income groups, and so they worry this might be classist or racist. And so there's a lot to be said in response to that, but one thing I've said to people in the past when I'm on college campuses is, I have here a magic wand, and when I wave it, it will make every minority vote from now on, but they'll always vote for Trump or people like Trump. Do you want me to wave the magic wand? And everyone says no. And I'm like, well, why not? And they're like, because that would lead to bad government. And I say, okay, so you agree with me that it's not simply that you vote, that it's how you vote. So it turns out upon pressure, people don't subscribe to what I might call the naive theory of democracy, which says that as long as people like you vote, then democracy will serve your interest. In fact, how we vote matters, and uninformed people vote in ways that are counterproductive.
I remember an old professor of mine, Gordon Tullock, one of the founders of the economic analysis of politics, started a graduate course, and I'm going to ask you the lousy question that he asked all of us. Why is democracy good without giving me the definition of democratic?
Yeah, why is it good? Like, here's what I would say, because I do defend democracy to some degree. Democracy is empirically correlated with certain good outcomes. It does better than some other things. So democracies tend to be better at protecting liberty, economic and civil liberty. They tend to be more prosperous than non-democratic regimes. And when we really look into that, it appears to be causal. It doesn't just appear to be that people that, like, civil libertarian societies are also democratic, but it looks like there's some reinforcement there. That said, we can do better. I mean, the BMW 3 Series is a wonderful car, but 5 years from now, they'll come up with an even better version of it. I think it's time to come up with a better version of representative government, too.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all other types. Maybe he was right. Our guest today certainly outlined lots of problems with democratic decision-making. Our second guest suggested that maybe we should change the mechanisms within democracy to take better advantage of more knowledgeable voters. Another thing we might consider is limiting the scope of democracy. Once we realize that there's problems with the decision-making procedure, maybe we should just let it decide fewer things and leave more of them to private enterprise and civil society. That's certainly a theme that resonates with me. See you next time.
Your favorite PBS shows, ready to watch when you are. Anytime, any place. Find more ways to explore than ever before.